Hi everyone, in this video I'm going to introduce the ethical theory called utilitarianism. Two of the founders of utilitarianism are Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. I'll talk a little bit in the video about how John Stuart Mill criticizes Bentham's version of utilitarianism and then adds another dimension to the theory. Your textbook also touched on Mill's contribution a bit. Both were English philosophers, moral philosophers, and both had a common goal, which was social and legal reform. That is, what they desired was to see corrupt laws and social practices changed. And in thinking about what laws we ought to change or reform, what practices need to be changed or reformed, they needed to have a standard. So in other words, well, what makes a policy morally right? What makes a policy morally wrong? What makes a law morally right? What makes a law morally wrong? What makes for an ethical law? What makes for an unethical law? And so the standard they applied is the standard of utility. A bad law has a lack of utility. That is, it doesn't create the greatest amount of happiness for everyone affected by the law. Another way of putting this is that a bad law lacks utility in that it doesn't create the greatest amount of pleasure for everyone affected. The terms utility, happiness, and pleasure can be pretty much used interchangeably, and I will do so in the course of this video. On the flip side of that, we would say a law is good when it creates the greatest amount of happiness, utility, or pleasure for everyone affected by the law. So here's an example. As a city, we have a piece of land, let's say, and we're deciding. So typically when you're looking at a utilitarian dilemma, there's some kind of decision that's being made. And typically, although utilitarianism can be used on an individual basis as an ethical framework, typically there's a kind of social policy or law at stake or in play. And so in this case, we have a piece of land, and we're trying to decide, should we build a hospital or a golden steam room for Martha Stewart? It's a pretty silly example, but what it does is drive home the point that Mill and Bentham were concerned about the fact that corrupt laws were only benefiting a very small number of people, whereas the majority of people weren't benefiting at all. So this is a sort of silly example, but in this case, Martha Stewart would benefit greatly, but the community wouldn't benefit at all from building the steam room for Martha Stewart, whereas a hospital would benefit the most number of people. So their goal as social reformers is to say, if a law or a policy only benefits a very small handful of people, usually the wealthy elite, then that's not a good law. That's not an ethical law. And what makes it unethical is that it doesn't produce the greatest amount of utility. That is, it doesn't create the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest number of people. So I begin with this motivation because I think it's always helpful to keep in mind when you're going through the exercises on utilitarianism. I think because utilitarianism does have some flaws, some major flaws, sometimes this aspect gets lost. But keep that in mind. Their goal was reform, social and legal reform, that would benefit the majority of people, and to get rid of laws or policies that only benefited a very small handful. So I said before, utility is happiness is pleasure, so just something to keep in mind as we go through. And the principle that they're applying, which you read about in your text, is the greatest happiness principle. So an action is right, and the word right is key here. We're talking about an action not just being, it's not neutral in terms of morality. We're talking about the rightness of an action. We're talking about the morality of an action. An action is right in proportion as it tends to promote happiness, wrong as it tends to promote the reverse of happiness. By happiness, we mean pleasure in the absence of pain. By unhappiness, the privation of pleasure. So the absence of pleasure. So whenever thinking about any situation, whether at an individual level or a social level, the question is always, does this action promote the greatest amount of happiness for everyone affected? So when trying to figure this out, what you're always going to create is called a hedonistic calculus. It's called a hedonistic calculus because what it takes into account are pleasures and pains. So hedonism is all about pleasure. So when we're thinking about is an action the right action, we have to think about the pleasure for everyone affected. Pleasure and pain is not the same as a pro-con list. It's not a pro-con list. And the reason is that we're talking about a feeling of pleasure, and it's a feeling that sentient beings can have. So what's nice about utilitarianism, one of its benefits, is that it isn't just about human beings. Any being that can feel pleasure and pain is accounted for. So utilitarianism could be used as a justification, for example, for vegetarianism, because it takes into account the pain felt by animals, not just the pleasure felt by human beings. So here's a silly example of a hedonistic calculus. I do the calculus always for one option. So you can always do it for both options, but typically you want to pick an option and then do the calculus. So I typically, every time I'm thinking about canceling class, say I'm feeling sick, or for example, last week I canceled a session because of the power outage that had been ongoing, I always in my head do a hedonistic calculus. And I think to myself, okay, yes, if I do cancel class, what are all the pleasures and pains involved in canceling class? The decision is yes, I will cancel in this case. This is actually a calculus I did with my students before, and I changed a little bit of it because in this case I wasn't sick, it was a power outage. But so I think about the pleasures for everyone affected. So I include myself, but I also include my students, and in my case I also include my dog. Because the fact is, one of the pleasures is that my dog will be very pleased, very happy that I'm at home that day. Students will feel pleasure, typically that's my experience. No commute, so some folks have a longer commute, some have a shorter, but no commute at all for anyone. Students could do something else with that time, so they could spend that time going out to eat was an example some gave, hanging out with friends, catching up with other coursework perhaps, something else they could do. If in this case I was sick, being able to rest and not have to worry would be a kind of pleasure, not have to worry about getting others sick. Potential pains would be students who don't get my email, still end up commuting, have a bit of pain because they put in the pain of commuting, wasting their time, wasting their gas, wasting their energy. Insofar as we've missed a class day and now we're behind on the syllabus, so any pains associated with that. And then, of course, missing out on socializing, getting to see one's classmates or group mates, as the case may be, would be a potential pain. So you really want to think about in a hedonistic calculus, everyone affected, including yourself, but never weighing yourself as more than anyone else. So this is one of the pros of the hedonistic calculus. It's extremely egalitarian, meaning everyone counts as one, no one counts as more than one. You don't get to prioritize yourself, you don't get to prioritize your friends, you don't get to prioritize your family. In a way, that could perhaps be a negative, as you'll see in some of the exercises this week. But for now, the idea is that when doing the calculus, you include everyone affected by the decision. That could be a lot of people depending on what the decision is. Or perhaps if it's a smaller group of people, it could be a pretty limited number of people. Maybe it's just you and one other person that are affected. So that's one of the pros of the hedonistic calculus. It's egalitarian. The con is, and this is what Mill introduces as his critique of Bentham, is when you're thinking about pleasure, if you're just thinking about quantity of pleasure, then it seems like it's a philosophy better suited for swine than people. Or in other words, it's a pig philosophy. Meaning, couldn't you be happier if all day you just sat around and ate and wallowed in mud? Why even be a dissatisfied Socrates when you could be a satisfied pig, as Mill puts it? So Mill introduces into the equation quality of pleasure. So what he says is, there are some pleasures that are qualitatively higher than other pleasures. So for example, you might say that there is a pleasure in eating junk food, but there's a qualitatively higher pleasure perhaps in going to a museum and seeing a new exhibit. Or we might say perhaps there's a qualitatively higher pleasure in spending time with one's loved ones or one's friends. Or there's a qualitatively higher pleasure in going hiking or something like that. There are certain pursuits that human beings have, such as art, philosophy, friendship, love, etc., that set us apart from other beings and that need to be taken into account in the calculus. So that we're not just thinking about quantity of pleasures and quantity of pains in units, but also quality. So here's the silly example that your book gives. Say, for example, if you didn't take into account quality, then hanging out with friends would be 20 units of pleasure. That sounds right to me. Whereas watching an episode of a TV show, let's say you like the show, it's a good show, you watch a TV show and it's 3 units of pleasure per episode. Well, if all you took into account was quantity, you just have to do a little bit of math, and if I watch 7 episodes times 3 units, well then that's 21 units of pleasure. Which means that, let's say it's a sort of a mini series or something, binging the entire series, all 7 episodes, is just as much pleasure as I would get from hanging out with my friends for that time. This is what Mill disagrees with. He doesn't think it works like that. He doesn't think that we can just do this equation and say, okay, well, if it's just 3 units for a TV show, I multiply that times 7 episodes, and then I get 21, which actually is more than the number of units that I would get spending time with my friends. He says this isn't right. We need to also think about quantity of pleasure. Or, I'm sorry, quality of pleasure in addition to quantity. That there's something qualitatively different about spending time with your friends than there is with watching TV. You could also think about this in terms of social media. If I send 100 tweets, and I guess maybe you don't send tweets, do you post tweets? Let's say I send 100 tweets. Does that equal let's say a 2-hour deep conversation with one of my friends? Do all those mini sips equal a gulp? As Sherry Turkle puts it in her TED Talk about social media. Her answer is no, that there's something qualitatively different about that 2-hour deep dive with your friend, talking about all things profound or mundane, that is qualitatively different than sending a bunch of tweets or scrolling through Facebook. So that even if each of these gave me 1 unit of pleasure only, and let's say this 2 hours gives me 100 units of pleasure, even though qualitatively it's the same, both are 100 units of pleasure, that even though quantitatively it's the same, both are 100, qualitatively it's not the same. There's a different quality of pleasure in that conversation with a good friend. The problem is, of course, you still have to do a hedonistic calculus, which implies, of course, that you need to somehow put quality back into the equation. How do we do that without reducing it back to quantity? So something for you to think about as you work through these. I don't have an answer to that question. Also, pain doesn't get as much attention in utilitarianism, but it's there. It's part of the calculus. So when I'm doing the calculus, I always think about, do the pleasures outweigh the pains? In the canceling class, usually they do. Usually I end up canceling if I'm debating it. But with pain, you also need to think about quantity of pain and quality of pain. That some types of pain are, we would say, qualitatively worse than other types of pain. And there isn't a way to really make up for that in just numbers. That there's something really qualitatively different. Like some types of pain or loss are just qualitatively much worse, much different than others. So, in summary, when thinking about is an action right, I apply the greatest happiness principle. In doing that, I perform a hedonistic calculus. I tally up all the pleasures for everyone affected by the decision and all the pains affected that affect everyone, for everyone affected by the decision. And then if the pleasures outweigh the pains, the decision is right. If the pains, on the other hand, outweigh the pleasures, the decision is not right. In order to do that, you need to think about, though, what is the decision? So in this case, I said, yes, I will cancel class is the decision. I weigh out the pleasures for canceling. I weigh out the pains for canceling. The pleasures outweigh the pains. Therefore, it is the right decision. It is the morally right thing to do. It is the ethical thing to do to cancel class in this case, because it meets the greatest happiness principle. It creates the greatest happiness, the greatest utility, the greatest pleasure for everyone affected.